Hey there, and welcome to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. My name is Chris Hayton, and this is part 3 of the beer distribution segment. In this episode, I chat with Bryant Soorkia from Ready Set China, who represents and imports a number of famous Australian beer brands into mainland China. Not a topic I thought I would cover, especially for those just starting their brewery building journey, but the opportunity to chat with Bryant presented itself, and I'm glad I did so. As craft is growing in Australia, so too an infant craft beer scene is picking up momentum in the largest economy in the world, China. Born and bred in Melbourne, Bryant has spent many years over in China. He's currently the North China Regional Sales Manager of 31GO, a beverage importer and distributor, and also has his own marketing consulting business, Ready Set China, which helps businesses outside of mainland China break into the market, helping them with brand representation in a vastly different consumer culture. In our chat, we discussed the potential opportunities for Australian craft beer brands to tap into the Chinese craft beer market, what the import regulations and conditions into mainland China are, the business and consumer culture differences between that of China and the Western world, and finally some important infrastructure aspects a brewery should have in place before considering sending their beer overseas. So I hope you enjoy my chat with Bryant Soorkia from Ready Set China and 31GO. Well, welcome, Bryant, to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. Thanks for coming on, mate.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And how we got in contact, a good friend of the show and previous guest of the show, Neil Playfoot from Asian Beer Network, who is also based in China, gave us an introduction to each other and said that you'd be a great guest to have on the show to discuss not just beer distribution, but a good contact for breweries outside of mainland China who have aspirations to actually get their beers into a massively growing beer market over there in China. So I'm really looking forward to our chat about beer distribution as well as beer imports into mainland China, which is not a topic we've actually covered on this show to date. But before we get into all that, mate, tell us a bit about yourself, your career background to date, how you got into beverage distribution over in China, and maybe a few little fun facts about, favorite breweries, beers or beer styles. Take it away, mate.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm originally from Melbourne, Australia, born and bred. And China has sort of been on my radar since I was quite young. I've been coming here for the most part of about 16 years, on and off. So over the duration of that time, I've acquired the language, I've learnt the culture and obviously the business culture as well. My history in Australia was in retail sales management. So sort of understand sales very, very well, but over the course of my experience with China, sort of recognized this market as a very evolving market and realized that it was somewhere that I wanted to sort of focus my attention. So that sort of just naturally transitioned into, the language study, and then did a startup back in 2015 where me and a business partner brought over some Australian red wine, Shiraz and Cab Sav. And back then, we weren't terribly experienced or knew what we were doing, but it was a great way to sort of get started. Yeah, and then so over the past 3 years, I've been representing a company called 31GO. Jiao means alcohol in Chinese, and 31 is the latitude of Shanghai. So 31GO is based in Shanghai, but I'm based in Beijing and look after the northern half of the country. So that's everywhere from, I don't know how well your Chinese geography is, but that's everywhere from Beijing all the way up to northeast China or Harbin, and then west to near Xinjiang, and then down south to about halfway point, which is Xi'an. Yeah, so a few fun facts, favorite breweries, beer styles. The funny thing is that I actually, prior getting into beverage import and distribution in China, I didn't know a terrible amount about the different styles of beer or anything. So I'm assuming that most of your listeners will know a lot more about beer in terms of brewing than myself. I'm more of a sales guy, actually. But yeah, getting into the market in China sort of was like discovering a newfound hobby. I used to drink beer, but I didn't know anything about it really before importing and selling it. So yeah, favorite styles would probably be hazy IPAs, very like more citrusy sort of style hazy IPAs. I love sours. Probably favorite sour would be out of from a brewery called Stone. You've probably heard of out of the US. Stone actually, until recently, was in China and they were doing it themselves, but they've actually recently just left, mainly due to the trade tensions with the US. But yeah, they have a Berliner Weiss, which is probably my favorite beer. Also a fan of wheats. Wheats are also very big in China as well. A few local breweries, probably two breweries that your listeners may have never heard of. One is Neopitang or Enbia, out of a city called Chengdu, southwest, and Jing'e, which is a Beijing brewery, and Mastergal, which is in Nanjing.
Okay, no, I haven't heard of those breweries before. I don't know if you've heard. I think there's a big brand over in Asia. Might not be quite in China, but Hong Kong. Is it Guilo or Guilo?
Guilo has received a fair amount of attention from the Western world recently because they did a collaboration with a UK brewery called Vocation. But in terms of the China market, it's really only one province that you'll find that, which is Guangdong, which is down south. Guilo is actually Cantonese. It means foreigner.
Oh, right.
Yeah, or gringo in Mexican Spanish, should I say. Yeah, but in terms of like domestic distribution, you probably won't see it many places in China, at least.
Cool. All right. Well, having a brief chat before we started recording today, we were sort of, trying to decipher how to introduce you in terms of, the company you work for. So you're basically contracted to 31 Geo, and you are essentially their northern sales rep or sales manager there in China, representing a portfolio of beer brands, including a number of Australian popular beers. Are you able to tell us a bit about, or go into a bit more detail about the service you offer, types of beers, brands you currently represent, and the type of brands and breweries that you tend to look at bringing on?
Sure, yeah. So 31 Joe, as mentioned, I represent the northern half of the country for them, amongst other things that I do, which I'll go into a bit later. But 31 Joe has been in the market now for about close to 15 years or so. And the business owner actually used to work for CUB in Sydney for quite some time, for about 10 years, I believe. So those connections obviously led to CUB brands, or CUB at the time. So we are the sole importer and exclusive distributor of fairly iconic Australian brands: VB, Victoria Bitter, Cooper's, Pure Blonde. We also did Mountain Goat for a while, other things like Peroni. Some of them we don't do anymore. But in recent years, we've also ventured into non-alcoholic and plant-based options. So Bundaberg Brewed Beverages, which is a 50-year-old Australian family-owned business out of northern Queensland. That's done very, very well for us, which sort of opened the can of worms of non-alcoholic products, such as plant-based milk, which we are doing a brand called Milk Lab by Freedom Foods, and specifically targeting the coffee, sort of new age dairy-free coffee scene. So that's a brief overview of some of the brands that we have. Obviously, when we look to bring on a brand, we consider a few different things. Number one would be exclusivity. There would be no way that we would do anything unless we have exclusive rights to the whole of China, excluding Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau, because even though they're one country, they don't really operate in the same systems. As well as scalability. We tend to only want to work with brands that have the ability to forecast, to scale up. And that being said, not because we're not interested in smaller brands, but mainly because if we don't, the market explodes and then we can't get enough stock in, and that's not good for anybody. So growth in China tends to be more parabolic as opposed to linear. So that's something that we tend to look for.
Yeah, well, there's some very iconic beer brands in your portfolio that you've just mentioned there. I mean, everyone listening knows VB, Pure Blonde, like you said, was probably one of the first low carb beer. I remember having that when I was 18, and and Bundaberg, just iconic beer brands. So I guess what I'd like to share with the audience today is just probably the people listening are looking at the aspect of or prospect of opening their own brewery. So it's, this sort of opportunity is probably a little bit away from where they're at in their business plan. But there is also some newly established or established breweries listening as well that, would be interested to know about some industry insights about mainland China. And I normally do talk about industry insights towards the end of my guest chat, but I thought phrasing this question at the beginning would, I guess, help explain to the audience early on the potential of the Chinese and Asian craft beer for Australian breweries, as well as other listeners from other countries. So I guess tell us a bit about the current state, growth potential, beer trends, etc. in China.
Cool. So let's go back to probably 16 years ago when I first came to China. There was really no such thing as craft beer back then. However, you could find beer on every street corner, at every shop, at every corner store around the country. It was all, low ABV, 2.5 to 3%, lager produced by companies called like Qingdao or Snow Beer, Harbin Beer. But it was really only that. And that's what everyone drank. And namely, they were mostly long necks or cans. Fast forward 16 years, and in tier one cities, and that's your Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Chengdu, the major, most populated cities that are experiencing the most growth, or have experienced the most growth, should I say. You can find, international craft beer brands at almost every bar you go to. There's more and more tap houses popping up. And I should say, even though there are breweries opening up, the vast majority of on-trade venues nowadays are actually a fuse between a supermarket and a bar. So if you picture walking into a venue and seeing every square inch of the walls lined with fridges and beer bottles from every corner of the globe available to the consumer to get up and take and pick up with their own hand and look at the back label, that's kind of where the market is going in terms of how the consumer can discover new craft beer brands. It's a little bit different in Australia, going to a brewery and, having a look at what's on tap, seeing the little plaque in front of you and saying, oh, can I try that? Can I try this? Yes, that does exist, but the vast majority of international brands are going to just sort of take shelf space on an on-trade venue in order to try and create traction. So it's important to know that when sort of trying to, design your strategy for China, because it is quite different from the Western world. Having said that, if you do some of the things right, your growth potential is really very exponential. Most brands in the first few years, I mean, you might sell a few containers in the first year, and that would be good. But I think the potential to go from a few containers to 30, 40 containers in a year and double year on year is really there. Growth is exponential, as mentioned. And a lot of people will say, if I can just get a piece of the pie in China, that, 1.4 billion people, if you can just get a piece of the pie, then that's great. But I tend to disagree with that sentiment, because if you can get a piece of the pie, you can get a large piece, but you just need to be willing to stick it out in the long run to be able to do that. As I said, growth is exponential. It's not linear. In terms of like different trends, I think it's important to mention format. So not just, on-trade venues and, how your product is visible, but the preference of the market in terms of how they consume your beverage. So bottles, the vast majority of the imported beverages in China are bottles. And that's mainly because the Chinese perception of bottles is considerably higher than cans. So craft breweries in Australia, in the Western world, obviously cans are a lot cheaper. Some countries, paper labels instead of directly on the can, printed onto the can, is obviously cheaper as well. But in China, that won't work, namely for transportation issues. When you're shipping containers worth of cans that have paper labels on them, they're going to get damaged during shipping. So because of all these other factors and the way that the consumer views the product to be of higher premium sort of status, bottles are generally the way to go. So we always advise, if the option is there, if the bottling line is available, go with that. If not, you can look to find a partner that could help you do that, etc. The formats, I mean, they're in terms of sizes, they come in all different shapes and sizes, obviously, but 330 ml is really the stock standard. Australia has this sort of retail industry where you go to Dan Murphy's and you pick up a six pack, you take it home, you drink it on a Friday night. But the Chinese market is really not like that. You go to a venue and you pick out one bottle, and then you pick out another, and then you pick out another, and then you pick out another. People seldom go and buy six pack to take home and drink with their family. It's a culture of togetherness. It's a culture of spending time with each other outdoors. It's a culture of drinking with other people. So for that reason, straight off the bat, you don't need to have six packs in your 24 packs. So, we only do 24 loose packs. We don't do six packs. And if you were going to do them in China, you'd just be spending extra money that you don't need to spend. Another thing to consider is different sort of drinking culture in different areas of the country. The country has 1.4, probably 1.5 now, billion people and growing. And there's something like 50 different dialects in the whole country. So different regions have different fundamentals, in terms of culture. So a couple of examples of this might be in northwestern China, in Xinjiang, which is the region I look after. When they go to a bar, they sit down with their friends and they look at a menu and they order beers by the case. So they might be 5, 6 people. And because of that, again, that face value, you can never be seen to order too less or something too cheap. So they'll order 3 cases of beer, 3 cases of beer between 5 people, of course, that have fairly minimal ability to drink alcohol. It's never going to get finished, but it's still going to get purchased because the value is worth more than the actual consumption. Another example would be in Dongbei or northeastern China. In winter, it gets to minus 35, minus 45 degrees, and it's freezing. There's nothing else to do but sit inside and drink. And that's exactly what they do. So, some areas down south in winter, our beer sales actually reduce, but in areas where it's freezing cold, our beer sales increase. So in every different region, there's going to be different cultures and different drinking habits that will affect, your sort of domestic strategy in China.
Yeah, some really interesting insights there about, I guess, the Chinese craft beer scene or just beer scene in general. The bottles thing, it's been a sort of a hot topic on this podcast so far about, Australia's trending shift away from bottles to cans. And, the usual brought up statement on this show has been that, Australia's 5 to 10 years behind the US market. And I think in my research before our chat, or maybe just in general reading, that what the Australian market craft beer scene or beer scene compared to the US is similar to that of China to Australia. Like, it's sort of a little bit behind of where the Australian scene is. Is that something you would agree as well?
China is, from that perspective, China is probably behind the curve. In terms of a variety, China is definitely ahead of the curve. China is more similar to the US in the sense that it has every possible type of craft beer that you could possibly imagine from every corner of the globe. But from a consumer perception point of view, it's behind the 8 ball because it still thinks that bottles are more expensive. Again, China is so different from the rest of the world that brands looking to enter it really need to spend the time, to do the research, to be ready, to talk to people that understand the market, because you could have a really, really good product and a really, really good beer, and you might have an amazing range and it performs so well in Australia and all your other export markets in Southeast Asia even. But in China, it could be the fundamental issue of the fact that it's in a can and not a bottle that could be the deciding factor of whether it's a success or not, because the Chinese people will look at it and think they might choose to opt for a cheaper Qingdao just because it's in a bottle, because it's perceived to be more expensive.
Yeah.
So it's behind the 8 ball in terms of education, understanding the market, understanding craft beer, but it's ahead of the 8 ball in terms of availability.
Yeah, and that's exactly some of the comments that has been thrown out by other guests on this show about how bottles in the Australian market used to be perceived. I used to think that beer in a bottle was perceived to have more of this premium quality about it, or it just seem to taste better. If I had a choice between bottle and cans, I'd go the bottles. You know what I mean? But since going on this journey of learning about the craft beer scene in a more intimate light, it's the benefits seem to outweigh so much on the other end with cans over bottles. But that's just only one aspect that we're really talking about. I guess the overall theme here is about, like you said, consumer education about the craft beer scene. And Australia is starting to become a lot more educated about it. And yeah, it's interesting to see where the Chinese market is at with it as well, because we've also had other guests on the show talk about, I think it might have been Neil Playfoot and could have been John Gonzalez from Bespoke, talking about what the Chinese palate is, and understanding that it's different to that of Western countries like Australia. So you mentioned in your opening statement that, wheat beers are a very big beer style over in China. Are you able to talk about, about the Chinese beer palate?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, like the early movers or the domestic production were Qingdao and Harbin, and they were all lager. They were all lagers. The very beginning of the sort of imported beer market in China, one of the first movers was Duvel, and Duvel sort of came in, saw it as a big market opportunity, and they brought in the heavy hitters. They employed lots of foreign staff and put them all around the country, had them pounding the pavement every day. And the craft beer movement sort of began with brands like Hohagen, or what's now available, Vedette, more wheat, fruitier sort of orientated flavors. Even to this day, those beers are still amongst the strongest international craft beer brands that you'll probably find in almost every bar, from tier 1 all the way up to tier 4 or 5 sometimes. So whether or not that contributed to conditioning the Chinese market to like wheat beers, I'm not sure. But I can tell you that from all, the taste testings that I've been involved in and all the on-trade activations around the country and etc., the general gist is that fruit works and lighter works and wheatier works. In recent years, there has been a fairly interesting uptrend for IPAs and, stronger, heavier, bitter beers becoming more sought after, but I guess that would probably be more in tier 1. But it is important to note that the way that the Chinese market works is that tier 1 looks to the Western world for ideas or for insights, and then generally those ideas and insights, sort of flow into tier 1. That's the reason why you can walk around Shanghai and the Bund and feel like you're in Europe, and you don't even need to speak Chinese sometimes in those international areas. The rest of the market, they look to tier 1, tier 2, all the way up to tier 5. They look to tier 1 to find out what the new trends are. So if something does well in tier 1, then it finds its way to the rest of the country. So my guess would be that IPAs are going to continue growing in popularity. Brewdog, I'm sure a lot of your listeners.
Yeah, they're going absolutely crazy at the moment, aren't they? I'm seeing they just receive so much more money these days to invest in overseas markets. Like I know that they're building tap rooms in countries all over the place, like Vegas. They've done an investment drive campaign, whatever you want to call it, over here in Australia. I think they're putting a tap room up in Brisbane. They've now just pivoted towards New Zealand. So, yeah, those guys are really making a big go of it.
Yeah, where all that funding's coming from, I'm not really sure, but it's definitely certain that they're making a dent in the global scene. They've also got a massive brewery in Shanghai as well. And yeah, Punk IPA, I'm starting to see it in a lot more distributor warehouses across the country, as well as AD and Bev's Goose IPA, Goose Island IPA. That's very, very popular. So that is indicating that there is a move towards IPAs, which is suggesting that, the Chinese market is really starting to adopt more and more variations of what they were traditionally used to, which was stock standard low ABV lager.
Yeah, it's interesting how the evolution of a culture's palate, maybe that's going a little bit overboard with the technical side of things. I'm not going Charles Darwin on people on the beer industry, but yeah, like I've mentioned about how when I first had a craft beer over in Australia, I think it was probably Little Creatures. and they, to me, are like one of the pioneers and trailblazers of the Australian craft beer market in recent decades, because having their pale ale, that hoppy balanced pale ale, it's so different. But now the beers you see now, like our palates and our sort of tolerance for bitterness in beers is much higher, in the sense that we can tolerate more hoppier beers. And it's actually, there's a big quench for more and more hoppier beers over in Australia. We're starting to be at that point of what the US was with that hop explosion in that market. And it's just really, really interesting to see how the palate shifts culture to culture. But
so it's interesting actually that you mentioned Little Creatures, just because an interesting sort of case study in China is that they came into the market a few years back, probably about 5 years ago, with a brewery in Beijing and a brewery in Shanghai shortly thereafter. And now the brewery in Beijing is closed. So their strategy was come in and open a tap house, and they didn't really tackle distribution at all. And that hasn't proven to be a good strategy for them in the long run. But I think the Shanghai one may still be open, but they've been discontinuing a lot of their beers as well. So it just goes to show that, well-known brands in other countries don't necessarily mean they're going to translate into China, which is why I will touch on some of the things that I think are important later on, that we sort of aim to help brands. But the craft beer palette, whether or not it's changing, potentially, I'm not sure. I guess over time everything changes, so probably.
Yeah, cool. And Brian, what would you say is the key criteria for you and 31GO for when considering adding a beer brand to your portfolio?
Yeah, so 31GO typically looks, number one is that we look for a product that we think is going to sell in the market. And how do we determine that? We determine that generally via its USP, or its unique selling proposition. So in many countries, a brewery's USP is going to be tied into how it tastes or tied into a new idea. But generally speaking, that doesn't always translate to China. An example might be a brewery out of Chengdu that has a craft beer that has a Sichuan pepper as the base ingredient for its flavor. And that's something that every Chinese person understands. Chinese hot pot. Everybody loves Sichuan pepper and Chinese hot pot, but it's something that you'll never find in Australia. If the roles were reversed, if I exported a Sichuan pepper lager to Australia and expected it to take off, it probably wouldn't. So we look for breweries that have something that's unique, but that's also understandable by the Chinese market. And so often we tweaking the brand story, tweaking the perception, or tweaking the positioning of the brand will work as well. The key criteria for 31GO, typically we don't look to work with breweries that don't have scalability, anything less than 500 hectoliters in the first year, and hopefully that's about 4 containers if they're hand stacked, and successively, year on year, 100% growth. We probably wouldn't really want to work with anyone smaller than that. As I mentioned before, format, we only really consider bottles at the moment. We've tried cans before, but they haven't really performed, so we sort of stick to bottles at the moment. Another big one is marketing support. And, as a ballpoint figure, usually 10% we aim to have in marketing support to be able to contribute to the market ongoing, because whoever said that you can just sell a couple containers to China and expect it to keep growing is smoking something, because that's not how the market here works. Our customers or distributors are constantly asking us for support, constantly asking us to do activations, constantly asking us to be investing in online, constantly asking us to be investing in live streamings, etc. But we can't do that without support from the brand. So, really, really important from an importer's perspective to be very close with the brand, and for the brand to listen to what we're saying, because often brands will have a marketing department and they might have a really amazing marketing team that's, been churning out content for the Australian market for the last 10 years. But the second that they're involved in China, none of that is relevant. And they might have structures, they might have ways in which they do things that when the new importer comes along and says, hey, by the way, can we get some new designs for, I don't know, table cards for regional cities for on-trade activations, and we need this and this and this and this and this. And the brand might say, well, that's off-brand. We're sorry, we can't do that. We've got 10 years experience. We know what we're doing. Unfortunately, that's a really, really big mistake because China is just so different to the Western world. And it's vital that the brand listens to the importer. So that's one of the things that we look for when talking, negotiating new products for our portfolios, is that dialogue is really available to us, and that dialogue is going to be listened to. Another key criteria, I think, is a range. For some reason, and I can't tell you exactly why, but for some reason, 5 products within the range, 5 SKUs within a brand's range is better than one. 3 is better than one. Different variations are better than one. So we probably wouldn't look, although we have done this in the past, like VB, but obviously VB's brand name is very strong. For new, smaller, medium breweries, we would want to see a range of different variations, and variations hopefully that have been developed for China. If not, we can pick and choose based on what we mentioned prior to the palate, etc. So that's basically what 31 Joe looks for. But I mean, me personally, I recognize that not every brewery in Australia, and there's hundreds, if not thousands, are really at that point of being able to be ready for a fairly large importer like 31 Joe that's distributing to every corner of the Chinese market. I think at one point we might have had over 100 distributors across the country. So in order to get to that point is quite vital. But sometimes that information is quite hard to come by, and the person that you do speak to is usually wanting to charge you an arm and a leg. So I also run a small consulting business, branding consulting, specifically for smaller brands that want to enter the Chinese market but don't know how. And that's where we aim to create the right amount of branding and position them correctly and set them up for success in China. I can go into that a little bit further down the line.
All right. No, there's some great sort of criteria there for breweries to sort of consider. And we will dive into more about that branding and marketing sort of aspect that breweries need to be considering getting into the Chinese market. I think that's very important as well. And talk to us a bit about, I guess, what the current interest is from a Chinese perspective or Chinese market perspective for Australian craft beer, and what the potential is for small craft breweries, I guess, to develop market share over in China.
So the potential is huge. It's one thing I would say straight away, though, is that it's not an overnight thing, and it's a long-term game. China is it's a long-term game, fundamentally because China is based on perception, and perception is based on recognition and word of mouth. So a brand that's just appeared, nobody's heard of it, and nobody's going to buy it. But a brand that, a perfect example of this would be Penfolds. Everybody now has heard of Penfolds. And even though it's not it's not an amazing winery in Australia, I mean, it's okay, but it's nothing superior or special. China has heard of it. China knows who Penfolds are, and every man and his dog has heard of Ben Fu, the Chinese name of Penfolds. So if someone has heard of it, it means that person will tell someone else, and if that person tells someone else, that person perceives it to be good. And that's generally the way that you grow in China. You play the long game, and you get your branding correct, and you prepare for the long haul once people start to get to know you more and more and more and more. So it's not a volume game. It is a volume game in the long run, but it's a brand building game. And brands that recognize that and are willing to stay for a while and play that game, I think will succeed. And the potential, as I mentioned prior, is exponential. It's not linear. It's parabolic. And once the domino start falling, you'll be struggling to keep up with demand. So yeah, so long as small breweries to medium breweries, as long as they play the long-term game and they get their strategy down pat and they know what they're doing and they're not expecting to explode overnight, the potential, even for smaller breweries is huge. It's a long-term game. Having said that, the Chinese market is not going anywhere. It's the greatest, the economy is the greatest form of legitimacy for the Chinese government. As long as brands can understand that it's a long-term game, and then they can have a strategy for the long term, and they find the right partner and they have the right information available to them, I think that even smaller breweries can really excel in the Chinese market. And I think the potential gigantic.
Yeah, that's it. Like I said, it's a subject that I didn't think I'd end up exploring on this podcast. I don't even own a brewery yet. I don't even have a beer in the market in Australia, and I'm talking about how to get beer over into China. So, but it's an interesting topic, and I think, like I said, a large percentage of the audience listening, are at that stage of either setting up a brewery, thinking about setting up a brewery, or newly established, but surely this is going to add a lot of value to those established ones that have some runs on the board in Australia and are starting to dip their toes into maybe Asian markets. So some absolute great takeaways there for them. Moving on to, I guess, a couple other questions I have on a brewery's preparedness. What would you say are some of the key infrastructure or business aspects a brewery needs to have in place before looking at sending their beer overseas? So, for example, we're sitting down with Andy Harris from Motors Transport here in Sydney. They're only a national provider here in Australia of craft beer, but we were talking about sales and marketing teams, and as well as what minimum production outputs for a brewery is, and as well as being a overseas venture of sending your beer across the seas to mainland China. Pasteurization and shelf life for beer and products needs to be considered. So without me rambling on continuously, I'll leave you to sort of comment a bit about some of those facts, and apologies if I've just swamped you with a whole heap of points.
No, that's all right. I'll start with shelf life. Shelf life is obviously vital. If we're talking about Australia, shipping time is usually about 3 weeks. And obviously there's customs clearance delays, depending on how complete paperwork is, depending on if there's any failing areas. I'll go into that in a second. But when you're selling to supermarkets in China, and this, I wouldn't recommend starting with supermarkets because it reduces your brand value over time. Not where you're going to find your brand value in China, at least. But supermarkets have a 6-month shelf life minimum, and they won't purchase anything less than that. So if you're considering a product that's got, let's say, 12 month shelf life, it gets out the door straight after production. It's on the ship within a week. You're looking at a arrival of about a month. So you've already lost a month there. Another 2 weeks customs clearance. Another maybe a week doing testing for COVID related documents that have come into effect this year. You're looking at about a loss of 2 months straight off the bat before you can sell it. That gives you a window of about 4 months to sell it to a supermarket. If you can't get rid of it in that time, then you're stuck with on trade, which is not a bad thing. But I think the key takeaway is that the longer the better. And so sometimes, from our experience at least, it is a negotiable figure, at least in China anyway. Shelf life doesn't necessarily need to guarantee that the product is going to be amazing 2 years down the track. But obviously that's something that we consider when we are looking at bringing on a brand. For example, Cooper's, because of the second fermentation in the bottle, they can offer 2-year shelf life. So for us, that considerably reduces our risk. We've also got a cidery out of New Zealand that gave us 18 months. So as far as we understand, it's a negotiable figure, and it doesn't have to necessarily abide by Australian law because it's not for Australian consumption. So that's important. The second, I might comment on sales and marketing team, and I did sort of touch on this prior. No matter how big the brand and no matter how well diverse or grounded or coordinated a sales and marketing team is in Australia, if that sales and marketing team doesn't listen to its China counterpart, then they may as well be no sales marketing team at all. So it is vital that they listen and that they act accordingly. And a lot of the time, the sales and marketing team cannot actually help because none of them speak Chinese, none of them read Chinese, none of them can help with all the branding that we need is all in Chinese. So most often what happens is the importer ends up doing it themselves, and there's a real communication breakdown and a loss of transparency. I'm not talking about us, but other importers, between the brand and the importer. And obviously that reduces trust, and it can only get worse from there. But I don't blame the importer because the importer is doing what they need to do because the brand doesn't have the capacity or ability to be able to assist or help, and they're not listening. So a marketing team, what their role is really is to maintain the brand's positioning and value all around the world. But with the case of China and with the lack of English and with the lack of understanding of the market, there is a lot of potential to break down there. So it is vital to sort of have that dialogue and solve those issues and make sure those links are strong. In terms of production output, I won't comment on how big the brewery needs to be in Australia. All I will comment on is probably for a small brewery, you wouldn't want to expect to do any less than 4 containers in a year, or you wouldn't want to plan to do any less. Let me just put it that way, because you don't want to run into a situation where a brand sticks, a brand gets some traction, and then the importer is struggling to buy more. So I wouldn't recommend just selling a container here, flogging a container there for a small profit, for a small short-term profit, when you can invest in upscaling and invest in expanding your bottling line or your brewery in Australia. And once you're ready, then you can start potentially even signing contracts for the first year, etc.
And Brian, are you able to, I guess, go into a bit of detail about the import regulations for beer into China? So talking about important considerations and takeaways for brewery owners when it comes to customs. Also know there are a certain set of standards and codes over in China. I think it's, from my research, the GB standards and HS codes. Are you able to go through some of those important considerations that breweries need to know about the import side?
Sure. So China is basically geared up to import from all around the world. So it follows every standard in terms of pallet size and all the rest. It is geared up to be able to import anything, basically. In terms of HS codes, it follows the same system as the rest of the world. And to import into China, there's two different ways in. One is called general trade, and the other is called cross-border. So for anyone listening that doesn't know what cross-border is, that's basically getting your goods sent into a bonded warehouse for e-commerce sale only. So that drastically simplifies the import process. But for the purpose of today's chat, I'll talk about general trade, because if you start with cross-border and you don't have any brand recognition, it kind of defeats the purpose anyway. So importing into China, there's 3 major taxes. There's the tariff, and that's obviously determined by the HES code, and whether or not there's a free trade agreement between the country for that particular HES code. So luckily for Australia, we have an agreement called CHAFTA, or China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And under that agreement, beer made from malt enjoys a 0% import tariff. So on top of that, you have to add consumption tax, which is 10%, and VAT, which is 13%. So all of these 3 taxes are calculated on the CIF price. So regardless of what your Incoterm is with the buyer in China, if it's CPT, if it's FOB, it's Ex Works, whatever it might be, it's still calculated. These 3 tariffs are still calculated on the CIF price. So combined cost of getting the goods to China, your freight or your cargo, and your actual cargo price. So once those are calculated, you'll get some documents, or your importer will have documents issued by the customs officer, which will then be used for reselling. So in order to clear customs, you need to have all the normal paperwork: bill of lading, commercial invoice, packing list, certificate of origin, certificate of analysis, health certificate, fumigation, or your no wood certificates, all the usual stuff. I will note that it is vital that exporters, if they've got no experience, they seek someone out that does, because even the smallest of typo errors on your documentation will lead to massive delays, and delays equals loss of revenue. So the longer your container is sitting at the port because it can't clear customs, the longer it costs your importer. And if you've got some sort of a long-term arrangement with them, it's probably going to cost you as well. So it is vital to make sure you know what you're doing and you can get your paperwork clear and handled without any errors. If you are looking for a HES code and you don't know where to find it, you can go to the Australian government's website, which is fdaportal.dfat.gov.au. That's a handy website to be able to find which free trade agreements in which countries constitute for which category of goods in Australia. That's a very, very useful tool. And if you're specifically looking at the Chinese market, you can also go to a website called www.cn-hscode.com. There's also English and Chinese available. One thing I would like to add there is that while Australia enjoys a 0% import tariff on particular products, some other countries don't. So that gives us a competitive advantage. For example, some European cider brands have to pay up to 45% as an import tariff. So 45 plus 10, that's 55 plus 13, that's 68% just in taxes to get your product available on the market in China.
Wow.
So sometimes very, very, very high. But having said that, those products still sell really, really well. So just because taxes are high doesn't mean there isn't a market for it.
Well, like you were saying, it's all about, I guess, value and the way things are perceived over there, isn't it?
Yeah, correct. Often the case, the more expensive, the more likely it is to sell, actually. So, coming into strategy, pricing strategies is a very important part of that. So I'll touch on after import, your importer is going to need to, once they clear customs, they'll have a document that's issued called the Guandan, or the Chinese Declaration Certificate, as well as the Weijian, or the health certificate. So that's basically China's version of your health certificate that you would have in the Western world. So you almost switch documentation once you come into the country. And in recent months, local governments have started requesting COVID test reports. So now it's becoming slowly general practice to, once your product lands in the country, to go and do tests, to get a third party to come and do tests on the outer case, the inner case, the outer bottle, the bottle inside liquid, and other areas of the goods, to do a COVID test and produce a 35-page long document just so that some restaurant or supermarket in Inner Mongolia doesn't get their business shut down because they can't produce this document. So a lot of red tape there, but red tape doesn't necessarily mean no business.
How does someone outside of mainland China even fathom to think that they could do it on their own? That you need to have someone. From the sounds of things, there's just so much you need to navigate and be aware of.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it to the faint of heart, like trying to do China on your own if you don't understand it. That's why, developing that relationship with either, the agency that's helping you or your import partner, and really striving to understand each other to the best of both parties' ability is absolutely vital. It really is vital because, and Chinese people understand this, and they're based, the whole Chinese, culture is based around putting in the effort, whether that be going out and drinking with them or taking them out to dinner, spending a couple of days with them, putting in the effort in order to be able to trust that person. Handshake doesn't mean anything in China, but spending a couple of days with them, that means everything. Getting that trust, getting that level of trust, it can often be the difference between successful brand and a failure.
Okay. And what about selling beer online in China or Asia? I guess talk about how a brewery could do this and what they need to be considering.
Sure. So e-commerce in China is absolutely exploding. One of the reasons behind this is because tier 2, tier 5, tier 4, everything between, everything other than tier 1, basically. Most average people don't own a computer, but they own a smartphone because there's no major barriers to entry in terms of purchasing one. You can get a smartphone for the most part of $100 nowadays, but a computer will still cost you $1,000. So in smaller, more rural parts of China, everybody has a smartphone, and because of this, there's this new craze for online shopping, and that's nothing new. Everybody knows that. Your major platforms like Tmall, Jingdong, and more smaller platforms that are sort of growing nowadays, like Xiaohongshu or Little Red Book, and even Douyin or TikTok. They're starting to sort of dabble in sales of goods and services, not just live streaming and social media. So the potential is there. And like I just mentioned live streaming. I think live streaming is an important topic to touch on because, I wouldn't go as far to say it's a fad, but it might be a fad. But it's irrelevant because KOL live streaming at the moment has the potential to move 11 containers of product in 2 minutes. So nowhere else in the world can you sell 11 containers in 2 minutes. But 1.4 billion people sitting on their phones at all hours of the day, following their favorite KOLs or key opinion leaders. They're called Wang Hongs in China. And they trust their recommendations so much so that they're willing to get purchased the second that they're told to. So because of that, it's a massive industry, and it's got huge potential for brands that are willing to tap into that. Having said that, it can be expensive, and a lot of the people that sort of specialize in this realm will tell you it costs anywhere north of $100,000 to do 1 minute of streaming or whatnot. But I tend to disagree with this, just because if you've got a good brand and you've got someone that's savvy enough, you'll be able to find well-known KOLs that are willing to do it for much lower price. If you go via agencies that are charging an arm and a leg to do it, you'll end up spending a lot of money. But there are ways around that. Other things, keyword advertising on Tmall and Jingdong, that's also another way to create revenue very quickly. Kind of like Google search AdWords type mixed in with Chinese social media marketing on e-commerce platforms. It's different, but there are some things that are similar. And after about a year of operation in China, you can apply for a flagship store. So once a brand has got a flagship store, it's automatically thrusted into that sort of well-known, recognized, perceived to be premium sort of ecosystem where people generally gravitate towards. So flagship stores take time, and they have to be approved by the platform owners, Alibaba, JD, etc. They don't just willy-nilly pick and choose any brand. You have to apply and get approved. But once you sort of get to that point, the opportunities are really, really endless. I think, to sum it all up, obviously I can't go into all the details in this conversation, but to sum it all up, e-commerce is really, really important, but it's even more important to not be drowned out with the noise. So if you're allocating 10, 20% of your sales, of your marketing budget towards e-commerce or even more, it's important to maintain that. So if you're going to start with 20%, make sure you stick to 20% for the next 5 years. Because if you pump in a significant amount of marketing spend in the first year and you get some traction, you might get some sales, you're like, wow, this is really working. But then the following year you decide not to do that, your brand will fall off a cliff as quickly as it came onto the scene. So it's important to maintain what you start with.
Yeah, well, I guess it's back to that, what you're saying. It's not linear, it's exponential in China. So I guess it works the other way when it comes to the way it falls off, I guess. And I've noticed in your notes there about the volume going out to China, when you are getting a bit of traction, it needs to be doubling every year almost.
If a brand's doing well, that's very normal to be doubling, and sometimes even more than that. I mean, if you're aiming for 50% growth, I think that would be conservative. For a brand that's got, sort of ticks all the other boxes, everything is right, everything's primed for growth. That's very normal, very, very normal.
Now, you also put together a list of some, I guess, beer and beverage trade fairs or expos in China or Asia. Are you able to talk to us about, I guess, what some of those are and some of the big ones and worthwhile ones for people interested in going over to mainland China and sort of getting a feeling of what it's all about?
Sure. So trade shows in China are a big thing, probably a bigger thing here than the rest of the world. And that's because China is obviously very centralized, it's very controlled, and it's easier management if you put everyone in the same industry into the same venue. So instead of having trade shows in multiple cities organized by private institutions, it's more efficient to have the government throw a big trade show in a city once every year and have everybody from that industry come and attend. So most brands that look to enter China have probably heard of CIIE and would probably be surprised when I say that it's not as important as the Chinese government makes it sound to be. It's, in my opinion, more facade, more a show of strength for the Western world that, China's really transitioning from an export-driven economy to an import-driven economy. And, you'll get a lot of brands attending and you'll see a lot of money spent on big trade stands, etc. But the bulk of those brands probably won't see much business after that. Having said that, the important ones in China are important. And for the sake of this chat, I'll mention two. One is called Tangzhouhui, or the China Food and Drink Expo, which is held in Chengdu every year, I believe in March, although 2021 and 2020 have been just postponed because of the risks involved with mass gatherings because of COVID, etc. That's the most important one, and you will find brands there in their first year that will be at that trade show every year thereafter because they've been doing so well. And of every year that I've been at Tongzhou, I've seen new brands that have just started, and following them closely over the years to come, they're always around because that's where you get the most visibility from the right distributors in the market. Every distributor covering every channel, covering every city is going to be at this event. So having a stand, spending some money and having a good stand, believe it or not, importers and distributors, they look at these things because it's a great demonstration to understand how willing a brand is actually to spend on the Chinese market and how willing they are to be involved in the Chinese market. The second one is called FHC, or Shanghai Global Food Trade Show, and that's held every year, I believe, in May, and probably not equally as important as Tongzhou, but up there. And so at this trade show, you'll also see food stuffs like cereals or any other food-related product that you can possibly think of that is looked to be imported, or is that it already is being imported. And just one thing I'd like to add on this is that when a brand wants to participate in a trade show in China, make sure you get your IP done first, because there are people that literally walk around these trade shows. And so, these trade shows have thousands of vendors, thousands of new brands that want to come into the market. But majority of the new brands don't have their IP. They don't have their patent registered or their trademark registered in China. So just because you've got a patent in Australia or under the Madrid Convention, which is covered by the whole world, it's not recognized in China. So it's vital to get that done. And once that's done, everything's fine. You can sort of rest at ease and know that your intellectual property is safe. But there are people that walk around and look for, with their phone out, and they type in the name of a brand and they see if it's been registered or not. And if it hasn't, they register it themselves. And so that really throws the brand under the bus when, they find it an importer quite interested in their product and things are moving well, but suddenly they discover from the importer that their brand has already been patented. And that causes a whole other ball game of problems that
cheeky little bastards
to avoid. yeah, but that's China. So I would say the benefits of these trade shows are actually quite large, namely because the connections. In China, it's really not what you know, it's who you know, although what you know is also important. Who you know is even more important. And these are the places that you'll meet the right people. People, they're in market that can help you, like myself or others, as well as importers and distributors. And they love to see brand interaction. And when they see that you're willing to be involved in the market and spend on the market, that's a very, very big selling point for negotiations around import contracts, etc.
Mm. And we may have gone over some of these points already, a bit about what you tend to see with breweries and new beer brands entering the Chinese market and some of the mistakes that they make or things they overlook. But are you able to quickly rattle off, I guess, what are some of your big common mistakes that you see with breweries dipping their toes in international beer distribution of their beer into China?
Yeah, sure. There's so many things that I can comment on, but it really comes down to one thing. I mean, it's more likely that at every stage of the whole process of getting goods from Australia or other countries into China and marketing them and selling them, it's more likely that there's going to be problems along the way, and there's going to be things that the exporter or the brander doesn't understand. So it really comes down to just trusting and listening to your import partner. What they're saying, make sure that their trust is there. You obviously can't take everything that they say. You can't trust everything they say because they might not be trustworthy. But if you've got a good relationship with them, you need to listen to what they're saying, especially when it comes to marketing, etc. Export paperwork, if you don't understand it, get someone else that does. Find a freight forwarder that knows exactly what they're doing. It's got experience specifically with China, because even within the logistics industry, dealing with China can be different from dealing with a different country like Southeast Asia or the US or whatever. And really just assume, make sure that you don't assume that what's normal to you may have been exporting for 10 years, but never sort of dipped your toes into China. Just don't assume that what's normal is going to be the same in China. I think there will be a lot of mishaps along the way, but nothing that can't be solved and nothing that can't be overcome, provided that you just follow this basic framework.
And I know we did talk a bit about earlier on the industry insights about how China is sort of going with the craft beer market and beer being imported by, places like Australia. Is there anything else you'd like to comment on, I guess, any industry insights, beer trends? Possibly, I'd say my listeners would be interested to hear about the impact COVID has had, especially over in China, on beer distribution and the craft beer scene in Greater Asia.
Sure. I'll talk about COVID because obviously that's a hot topic nowadays. Believe it or not, the only major negative effect on sales because of COVID was 2020, March, April, and into a little bit of May. But every month thereafter has been nothing but growth and stability. There has been some uncertainty in the market, but that hasn't really affected the demand, believe it or not. And I say this, like I mentioned before, because the Chinese government is so focused on economic growth. It will do everything in its power to prevent the market from crashing. And I can't see a day where it's going to crash anytime soon without being bailed out or without doing something that would be considered illegal in the West in order to make the country survive. Anyway, the effects on mobility last year were fairly great, though, just because of regional outbreaks in different areas and the need to get COVID tests and certain areas becoming high risk zones, etc. And people were a little bit afraid to get stuck in certain areas. So the mobility was greatly affected. However, everybody has a QR code on their phone. Everybody, as long as they follow the system, they can have a sense of confidence that they're not going to contract COVID. And because of that, the economy kept moving and sales kept going. So people, I think, just a country that is used to doing business face to face when it comes to negotiations, at least, and relationship maintenance, people adapted to doing contract negotiations over the phone or talking about the 2021 plan over the phone. Something that probably wouldn't have been so accepted prior is now fine. And that's interesting for a country that's so tech savvy and business is done over WeChat. But when it comes to maintaining relationships, that's important and that needs to be done face to face. But people understand that that's had to change this year. So that's 2020. 2021, there has been no major effects on distribution other than what I mentioned before about the new COVID testing certificates. So that's not an official announcement that hasn't come out. That's not public to domestic policy of distribution anymore at the moment, but that's just regional governments playing regional games for imported products. And whether or not that's political, I guess we will see in the future. But my guess is that it's just going to eventually fade away.
Well, Brian, mate, some absolute great advice there surrounding the whole export and import market into China. And once again, a lot of people listening, even though that they're probably not at that level of moving into that sort of space with their beer, but some great sort of, I guess, insights into how it all works. And I'm sure that if they are going to be successful, they have a plan to be successful, that they may one day be talking to people like yourself. So it is important for them to know some of this stuff early on. But mate, just for you to tie it all off neatly for everyone, are you able to just finish it off with some closing thoughts and advice for everyone?
Sure. Number one, I'd probably say whatever you do, don't listen to the media. The media has a tendency to paint a terrible picture for China, but more often than not, it's not actually the case. There is a lot of red tape, but it can be navigated. And I think the key to that is just finding people that know how. And then rule 101, really understand your consumer. And if you don't understand them, find someone that does and listen to them. And as I said, that can really be the difference between success and failure. Just don't assume that a brand that is really, really well known outside of China is going to do the same here. But equally said, that presents an opportunity for small breweries to compete against the big boys like Bev in China, because it's really an equal level playing field. It's it's how you present yourself, how you choose to position yourself in this market, how you portray what your brand is about. And in many aspects, I think that's far more important than the product itself, like how the product looks, how it is perceived, what the brand does. It is more often than not more important than what's inside the bottle itself. So yeah, so just find someone that can help, I think, and don't neglect the need to prepare or the need to localize, because I think that will pay off if you do.
Perfect. And before we do sign off, mate, give you the opportunity just to plug, I guess, some of your services, because like we were talking offline, yes, you are somewhat of an employee of 31GO. However, you have your own company called Ready Set China. Are you able to tell the audience a bit about that?
Sure. So everything that we've sort of talked about today is mainly for, brands that are a bit more ready to dip their toes into the Chinese market. But obviously, I understand that smaller breweries may not necessarily be there yet. And so Ready Set China is basically about assisting, small to medium-sized beverage brands, assisting them to understand the market and to be able to launch in the market and excel long-term. So this is basically comprised of a bunch of different services, but within three main categories, and that's prepare, and that includes your market research, your brand localization, getting all your intellectual property patented and protected, as well as crucial importer introductions. So taking your product and introducing them to a range of different importers around the country that may or may not be interested in your product, depending on how much of the preparation we've done together. So the second stage is really promoting it. And once you've got that import partner locked in, we sort of focus on trade activations, designing some POS, IP, some POS for the market, some POS for supermarket shelves, if that's the route that you want to go down. So we also look to design an e-commerce strategy and put you in touch with the right partners, as well as offer some logistics assistance around exporting. If your brand doesn't necessarily know what they're doing, we can help, and we can help on the import front as well. And then lastly, once the brand's got a bit of traction, we look to increase performance, and that's domestic distributor introductions. So we pull from a network of over 50 different distributors around the country, and we also can offer brand management for those brands. So if you want to maintain certain aspects of your brand identity in the market, we make sure that those things are not broken, and we can basically act as police for the brand in the market. So a whole range of services, everything from A to B, basically, and that's why we're called Ready Set China. We're all about launching small brands in China. So if you would like to have a chat with me about any of the services that we offer, or if you're a bigger size brand that would looking for an import partner specifically, I can help you with all of that. So you can contact me on Bryant, Bryant, at readysetchina.com. You can also check out my website, readysetchina.com, or you can contact me directly on LinkedIn. My name is Bryant Soorkia. That's spelled Bryant, S for Sam, Oorkia.
Perfect. Well, once again, another awesome episode, I think. I'm so glad that I was able to get you on the podcast and talk about distribution in China, and so much to take away from that. So I'll leave it at that, mate. Everyone, that was Bryant Soorkia from Ready Set China and 31GO. Thanks for coming on the Build Me Brewery podcast, mate.
No worries. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. That was part 3 of the beer distribution segment. In part 4 and our final episode of the segment, I sit down with multiple beer entrepreneur Rich Coombs from new and exciting business-to-business ordering platform called Caddy, which helps streamline the relationship between suppliers and customers within the wholesale distribution space. As always, if you are liking the podcast so far and find the content useful, please give us a follow and rating on whatever platform you're listening on. Also, follow us on all our social media handles, as well as visiting our website, www.buildmeabrewery.com.au. And I will also mention to listeners that we now have a new Build Me a Brewery discussion group linked to our Facebook page. This is a group of keen listeners and like-minded people discussing their brewery build plans and providing advice to others on the subject. Link to this group will be in the episode show notes. I'm Chris Hayton, your host, and this is the Build Me a Brewery podcast.